This is Henry Ford. He was an unknown mechanic who built a motor company that would go on to change the world. He introduced the first moving assembly line for cars, which enabled his company to make automobiles so cheap that almost everyone could afford one. Today, we're going to tell you how he did it. But before we jump into it, now back to the video. 10 Humble Beginnings. Henry Ford was born on a farm near the small town of Greenfield, Michigan, on July 16, 1863. Growing up, he helped run the family farm and developed an affinity for tinkering. As a young man, he developed an interest in engineering. At age 16, he moved to Detroit to study at the newly established public high school. When he graduated in 1880, he secured a job as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, where he worked for the next 20 years, becoming an expert in engines. On evenings and weekends, he would work out of a shed behind his home building quadricycles, three-wheeled vehicles powered by gasoline engines. And it was here that he developed the skills that would later enable him to produce the first quadricycle equipped with 4 wheels, which he built in 1896. Although his friends encouraged him to take his invention to market, Ford was reluctant. It would take another 7 years of planning and preparation before he would feel confident enough to try and start a car company. 9. Founding the Ford Motor Company. Though his first quadricycle had been a success, Ford knew that if he were going to make a name for himself in the auto industry, he needed something better. So he partnered with 2 local businessmen to establish the Ford Motor Company. On June 16, 1903, with funding from his investors, Ford set up shop in a rented factory in Detroit and hired a team of engineers to help him refine his new quadricycle design. By November, the first quadricycle was completed and named the Model A. The car was a huge hit, selling quickly for $1,000 a pop. But the excitement was short-lived. One of Ford's partners embezzled the company's funds, and Ford was forced to fire him. Then the original investors pulled out after failing to see a strong return. With his company on the verge of collapse, Ford took out a $5,000 loan against his house and began designing a new, even cheaper car. But before he could complete it, his engine shop burned down, forcing him to rebuild. He used the new $5,000 loan to pay for the repairs and purchased an old abandoned iron foundry to serve as a new workshop. It was here that he completed his masterpiece, the Model T, which was so revolutionary that it went on to become one of the best-selling cars of all time. 8. The Model T, introduced in 1908, the Model T, or Tin Lizzie, as it was affectionately nicknamed, was an immediate hit. The simple black car, with its bulbous shape and shiny paint job, looked like nothing else on the road. And its design was as ingenious as it was beautiful. Instead of having separate components manufactured by different companies and then assembled at the end, Ford built the entire car from scratch at his plant. He kept the design simple, relying on only 78 parts, each of which was a duplicate of its counterpart. Not only did this save on cost and manufacturing time, it also reduced the chances for error. It wasn't long before the Tin Lizzie hit the roads across America. For the first time, the average person could afford a car. Within months of its introduction, 10,000 Model Ts had been sold. 7. The moving assembly line. As the popularity of the Model T grew, so did demand. But Ford simply couldn't produce enough cars fast enough to satisfy customers. On one fateful day in 1913, he stood on the floor of his factory, observing his workers trudge back and forth across the shop floor, carrying heavy engine blocks. "Why don't we bring the men to the work instead?" he asked aloud. And thus the moving assembly line was born. From that day forward, The engine blocks were placed on a moving conveyor belt and brought to the workers, who would add major components like the crankshaft, pistons, and valves. After which, the engine was dropped into the chassis and the workers moved on to the next station. This system reduced production time from over 12 hours to less than 3 hours per vehicle. Ford could now churn out cars faster than ever. Before long, he was producing 200 Model Ts a day. By 1924, the factory was turning out over 1,000 cars every day, and there wasn't a single worker in the factory who hadn't been hired within the previous year. The secret to Ford's success was simple: the assembly line. By dividing complex tasks into simpler ones and then training workers to perform just one action repeatedly, Ford was able to boost productivity while simultaneously reducing costs. Other manufacturers took notice and soon began implementing the assembly line into their own shops. No. 6. Revolutionizing labor. The introduction of the assembly line enabled Ford to manufacture automobiles at record speeds. But there was still one thing holding him back: his workers. Even though the work on the assembly line was faster and easier than any other job in the factory, it was still pretty dangerous. Workers risked life and limb every time they stepped foot on the shop floor. Also, because the jobs were repetitive and often tedious, workers became easily bored and frustrated. As a result, the turnover rate at Ford was incredibly high. Every month, it seemed that half of his workforce quit, and he was forced to start the lengthy hiring and training process all over again. And so, in 1914, Ford decided to shake things up. He announced to the press that effective immediately, every full-time worker at Ford would receive a $5 a day wage, more than double the industry average. Overnight, Ford became known as the workers' benefactor. The media hailed his decision as a humanitarian gesture, and thousands of workers flocked to Ford, eager to earn big bucks. By increasing the wage, Ford was able to reduce the high employee turnover, which gave him a reliable workforce to manage. And by paying his employees $5 a day, he ensured that they had enough disposable income to purchase his cars. By improving labor conditions, Ford not only made his company a more profitable place to work, he created a loyal customer base that fueled his company's growth. No. 5. Mass production. The combination of the moving assembly line, interchangeable parts, and high wages made Ford Motor Company an unprecedented amount of money. By 1918, Ford was making nearly $1 million a day. With his company at the top of the charts, Ford set out to expand operations and solidify his lead in the automotive industry. He began to implement a series of policies known as Fordism. Among these policies was the adoption of high-volume, low-cost production methods, greater efficiency, and higher wages. These ideas spread throughout the corporate world and became the blueprint for mass production. To fully realize his vision, however, Ford needed to bring the cost of production down, and so he set about controlling every aspect of the manufacturing process. No. 4. Vertical integration. Until Ford came along, most automakers relied on suppliers to provide the raw materials needed for manufacturing. This meant that he didn't have control over the quality of the product, and was at the mercy of suppliers whenever he needed a large order filled. To combat this, Ford began to buy out competing companies and bring their operations in-house. He wanted to be able to rely on himself for all of his raw materials. In the early 1920s, he purchased mines in Canada, iron ore fields in Minnesota, and vast tracts of timber in Michigan and Kentucky. He even bought glass factories and metal scraper companies to supply his shops with the tools needed to build windshields and fenders. Altogether, Ford owned over 40 different companies by 1927. His ultimate goal was to construct a self-sufficient manufacturing campus where every aspect of production would occur under one roof. And in 1927, he accomplished his goal. No. 3. The River Rouge complex. Sprawled across 1,000 acres of land in Dearborn, Michigan. The River Rouge complex was unlike any other manufacturing facility in the world. If it were a city, it would be considered one of the largest in the country. Instead of high-rises and bustling thoroughfares, however, the complex consisted of hundreds of buildings and employed over 100,000 people. It included a steel mill, a power plant, warehouses, laboratories, tool shops, foundries, machine shops, an iron foundry, an aluminum foundry, an engine plant, body and paint shops, an upholstery shop, an experimental shop, a pattern shop, a pipe plant, a glass factory, and 2 enormous assembly plants. By 1928, Ford had succeeded in his goal to vertically integrate his manufacturing processes. Now all he had to do was sell cars to fund his growing empire. No. 2. Paternalistic management. Even though Ford was a progressive thinker when it came to wages, he was extremely conservative when it came to running his company. Ford insisted that his employees live according to his moral code. Employees who drank alcohol, gambled, or smoked cigarettes were given an ultimatum: quit or be fired. Ford's management style has since been labeled paternalistic, meaning he treated his employees as if they were his children. He worried about them, cared for them, but also expected them to do as he demanded. In fact, Ford was so concerned with the well-being of his workers that he hired a team of private investigators to follow them around off the clock and report back to him with information about their activities. These reports were filed in the company's sociological department, where they were kept on file for performance reviews. Ford believed that alcoholism was the root of all evil, and he made it his mission to root it out of his company. He prohibited the sale of alcohol on company property and searched employees' lockers and cars for bottles. He even went so far as to open an in-house restaurant where he served free meals to employees to prevent them from drinking on the job. No. Controversial views. Although successful in the automotive industry, Ford was deeply involved in politics and social issues as well. He was an outspoken anti-Semite and supported conspiracy theories that blamed Jewish bankers for causing World War I during the war itself. He was a pacifist who opposed American involvement and criticized President Woodrow Wilson for keeping the country in the conflict. After the armistice, he continued to speak out against the treaty that ended the war, calling it a fraud and saying that the US should leave Europe alone. After starting a motor company in South America, he returned to the United States and began planning a new town for his employees. In 1926, he purchased 26,000 square miles of land in the heart of the Amazon jungle and set about building a worker-s utopia called Fordlandia. Ford hoped to alleviate working conditions in his factories by building a more pleasant environment outside of work. But his plan fell apart when employees contracted malaria and Ford was forced to abandon the project. Nonetheless, Ford's